door.
Oh, okay. Look, I'm a place here. All right, are you ready? Hosea.
This was a toughie.
It was a toughie. I mean, like I said, I've never taught Hosea before, but let me say this about this study, this particular book before we go any further. I think I know how you approach this study this week. I think there are at least 3 different ways that you approach this book. First of all, first way was you may have read it once and said, none of this makes sense. I'll just let Betty explain it when we get there. 2, you may have read it in a couple of different translations and said, this still doesn't make sense. I'll let Betty explain it when we get there. Or 3rd, some of you I know dug in. I mean, you really tried to understand what was going on, but it was tough. I mean, this was a tough one. How do I know that? Because if I was in your place, that's what I would have done. I probably would have read it a couple of times and thought, I'll just wait and see what the teacher has to say about this. But as I was thinking about that, I thought, this is like that Wuthers original commercial, the caramels, where the guy says, when I was little, my grandfather gave me the Wuthers original, and now I'm the grandfather, and I thought, okay, so now I'm the teacher, and I can't just wait and see what somebody else is going to say about it. So I've spent all week really struggling with this, and I really had to do some digging to explain this book of Hosea. I mean, I knew the story. We often talk about every book in the Bible having its claim to fame. If you didn't know anything else about Hosea, you knew that he married a prostitute or the harlot. But, the funny thing is that's just a very small portion of the book. And we may not have realized that. But like I said, I haven't studied it or haven't taught it before, so it took quite a bit of digging for me to get here. But before we get into that, the preacher's commentary, one of the commentaries I was using, the preacher's commentary on Hosea said, a study of Hosea is disturbing before it is comforting. And I thought that was a really good way of putting it. So let's talk about it. What are your thoughts on Hosea? I want you to ask questions as we go along. Ask anything you want to ask. I may or may not know the answer. But what were your thoughts on Hosea as you studied it this week?
You would have to have some knowledge of 1st and 2nd Kings and Numbers, and you'd have to have some knowledge of some of the other books in the Old Testament to even grasp it at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I would read a few chapters and I'd go, I just have to lay it down. I'm just like, I just can't even make...
Yeah, can't make heads or tails out of it.
Heads or tails out of it.
Yeah. Exactly. What else? Everybody else feel the same way? Yeah?
Yeah, I start reading, I think, I can't remember this. I thought I knew this, but did I know that? Or everything just became really... I'll run together for me.
Well, I couldn't understand why, if Israel's name was used in one verse, why it had to go to a different
Ephraim. Why did he call him Ephraim?
Yeah. Ephraim or Ephraim. It's Ephraim to me.
Yeah.
I'm just like, and that could be in the same chapter.
Yeah.
So why not just use Israel each time you're talking about Israel, or Ephraim each time you're talking about Israel? Mm-hmm. Why one sentence?
Why switch back and forth?
Back and forth, which threw me.
Yeah, and if you didn't know that Ephraim, the nation of Ephraim was within the boundaries was one of those 10 northern tribes, you think, okay, are we talking about a person? Are we talking about a place? Because places were named after a person.
And
what's the deal here?
I understood that they were using Ephraim because it was like the most powerful in those 10 tribes.
Yeah.
So it would make sense that if they wanted to name something to represent Israel, it would be the strongest of the tribes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I understood that part of it, but it still didn't make any sense why they
switched back and forth. I think a lot of that I ran into several different things talking about that. One was that because Hosea was from there, that he used those terms interchangeably. Like we might talk about, you might talk about University of Tennessee, or you might call it the Hill. People would they call it Balls. You use those terms interchangeably, and you know what you're talking about. Or someone that you know well. You might go from calling somebody named William, they might call him Will, or they might call him Bill, interchangeably. So there was that, but there was one other thing, and I know, I already know, I've got this written out, but I know I'm going to be jumping back and forth on some of it because as these questions come out. One other thing was that Assyria, who would eventually take Israel into captivity, Assyria came in 733 BC and they didn't take the area that we know as Galilee, but they made them pay tribute. And so the upper northern area was more weakened. Therefore, the further down, the further south, I guess you would say, of the portions were still strong. Ephraim was still, as you said, of the stronger part. So the colored map will show you more on that one, just as a reference point. But that was one of the reasons that jumped back and forth. What else?
Sometimes it was there was a few places in there that it seemed like he was speaking to Judah.
Yeah, he does. He does actually speak to Judah. Now, there are some commentaries that say, that was added in later by another editor. No, he spoke to Judah because Judah was doing some of the same things, some of the same sins. In fact, I've mentioned this before, but in Ezekiel, and I keep meaning to look it up, but I forget what chapter it is, but in Ezekiel, there's a portion where Ezekiel talks about Judah. Of course, he's more concerned with the southern kingdom, but he will talk about your sister Israel. So they were sister countries. They were originally, of course, part of the same country, but they were considered like sister countries. And he said, your sister to the south would do these things. So when he was talking about Judah, he was concerned about Judah. That wasn't his main concern. His main concern was Israel because that's where he lived. But he's still concerned about Judah. It's like, anywhere you live, we're more concerned probably about East Knox County than we are anywhere else, but we're still concerned about things that happen west. Yeah, so, that might be mentioned, but you're right, he does.
Something else confusing, in a lot of his sentences, I'll say, when he was, if he was referring to God as he, it wasn't capitals, it wasn't capitalized. There was just different places that I would have thought he was referring to something, referring to God.
Does your translation normally capitalize pronouns for God? See, that's the difference there. Some translations do and some don't. Anywhere. If you take a quick look in the Psalms, they'll tell you right quick if it does. Now, the New American Standard does. The New King James Version does.
This is the New International Version.
Yeah, I don't think it does. I don't think it capitalizes it. And so, really, I think that's hard because you've got to determine who the he is. And, we've often said you need to know who the pronouns are. You need to trace it back until you know who the pronoun is referring to. Well, it makes it a whole lot easier when it's capitalized. It's easier to spot it. But I don't think the NIV does. No, this NIV doesn't. So that's probably it's the translation in that case. Yeah. What else?
I had to start about 4 times before I realized what the story was all about.
Yeah.
And then I got to thinking, this man must have been really committed to God.
Yeah.
And for God to ask him to do what he asked
him to do. Exactly.
Just had to he had to wonder if God loved him. I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about that somewhat in depth when we get actually to the verses. But yeah, I mean, yeah, you want me to do what? Yeah, exactly.
And I follow that up with, some of the more simple things that's easy to do that God asks and expects us to do, and we complain.
Yeah, yeah, that kind of puts it in perspective a little bit, right?
And the other question that I have, and this might sound crazy to y'all, but the definition from a biblical standpoint, is that a person who sees a lot of men, or would it be a woman who sees another woman's husband, or
It's great.
not married to?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hold that thought. We'll talk about that when we talk about that part of it more. If I forget and don't answer it to your satisfaction, be sure and ask me again. But I think we'll cover that when we get to that point. Okay. What else? Sandy, you about started to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, I didn't spend as much time with it this week as I would have liked to, but as I was reading through it, and I just have to give a commercial for my Amplified Bible.
Yeah, Amplified's a good
so
one, yeah.
Awesome. But chapter 11 is my favorite chapter in that book. And a lot of this stuff is unclear, and all the studying I've done with the 12 tribes and all of that. I mean, that really helped me as I was reading through it, the background that I've been studying for a while. But chapter 11, I think, it just talks about God's heart.
Yeah.
I led them with bonds of love.
Yeah.
How can I give you up? I mean, after all of that, at the beginning, it's like you get to that point, and it's just such a clear picture of the heart of God.
Yeah, His love. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Seems more compassion than with Amos.
Yeah,
and
and
little tenderness.
yeah, you see that. And I put that in your study on your study page, and it had actually said that in one of the commentaries that I was reading that Amos was more astute, more this is it, harsh, but we see the love of God in the book of Hosea, and we see the tenderness of Hosea himself, and just you got to know that it's because of what he went through. But you see that. What else? Sure, you got any thoughts on him?
Can't wait to hear what you got to say.
You didn't just read it and say, I'm going to wait and see what Betty has to say, did you?
I did the second.
Yeah, first thing I usually do is read it through in my New American Standard. That's my go-to study. And then I read it in the NIV, because I usually keep both of these beside the bed. And then I'll go back and forth, checking words and stuff. And then sometimes I'll read some of it in the King James, where I've got the actual Strong's numbering, where I can look up what the words mean. Sometimes I pull out the New Living Translation, especially whenever I'm writing it. Sometimes if I'm going to quote something, I'll pull that out, because it's just got a better flow to it. But it's just the first couple of times I read it through, I was just like, I don't know where we're going to go with this. I really don't. And then I just started jotting down things, started making notes, things that hit me. So, anything else you want to say about just reading it, or any questions?
I just want to say, I just got, one of my confusion is all these things that were going to happen. Did they happen, or are they still going to happen, or?
Many of them, the things that were to happen to Israel specifically happened. Now, the things of God's calling them back and God's mercy, some have happened and some haven't. Some even have happened, and we'll talk about Deuteronomy. Some of those things have partially happened. Ultimately, it is not like the end of it, chapter 14, particularly. A lot of that has not happened. A lot of the things will take place during the millennial kingdom. that they haven't taken place yet. But as far as how they were treated and taken into captivity, yeah, that happened, and it happened just the way that he said it would.
In chapter 3 and verse 5, the latter days, I had to spend some time on that to figure out, because sometimes it seemed like it was, immediate, the Messiah, but no, that wasn't when he came, but no, that wasn't it, because it doesn't fit. And then I came to the conclusion it was probably Jesus' second coming. I don't know.
That's right. Chapter 3, verse 5. Afterward. And here's your clue on that. The sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord. Okay. Is Israel in the land? Yes, they are. Have they sought the Lord? No, they haven't. But this is they will seek the Lord their God. And then David, their king. David will be the king during the millennium. He's called a prince. Jesus is the king during the millennial reign, but David will be there, and David will be ruling too. And so they will be seeking David. And they will come trembling to the Lord and his goodness in the last days. That's the millennial reign.
Well, what about the Messianic Christians that are over there now?
The Messianic Christians, they are considered a part of the bride. They're the church. That when the rapture takes place, they'll be taken out because they are Messianic. They have come to believe in Jesus Christ, so they are part of the bride of Christ. So they will come back with Christ just like we will at his second coming. Any other thoughts on that? You look like you got a thought.
No, I'm just saying, I'm ready.
Okay, you're ready. You're ready. Okay, everybody's ready. All right. Well, we said this has already been said, or Elaine said, we said last time that in order to understand Amos, we really needed our maps. We needed to know the locations. We needed to know where all these places were. We need to know the geography. Well, in order to understand Hosea, we need to know Israel's history. And, in that, most of us are sorely lacking. And we just don't know it like we should. Many times, Hosea will just mention a place or an incident, like in verse 4 of chapter 1, where it says, and the Lord said to Hosea, it's over this first child is born, named him Jezreel, for yet a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. Well, if you don't know who Jehu is, every time I think of Jehu, I think of, we call people Yehu. Yeah, but Jehu, he's a real person. If you don't know who Jehu is, or you don't know what happened in Jezreel, you're lost right off the bat. And honestly, even after going back and reading the incident that he is referring to, I was still confused about it, because when you read the incident, at first glance, it looks like Jehu did a good thing. He killed the prophets of Baal. He killed Jezebel, killed the prophets of Baal. I mean, Elijah told him to do that. You'd think, okay, he's on target, but yet here it says, the bloodshed, and he's going to be punished for. Wait a minute, I thought he was told to do that. Well, actually, he did what God told him to do, but if you have to read it closely, he went beyond what God told him to do. He killed a lot more people than God told him to kill, and then he lied about it. Oh, I didn't do it. That was the problem. If he had just done what God told him to do, God would have blessed him. But no, he had to take it further, and then he had to lie about it. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. Hosea will mention a place like Gibeah in chapter 9, verse 9. You don't have to turn there, but he says, they, talking about the Israelites, have gone in deep depravity as in the days of Gibeah. He, that is God, will remember their iniquity, and he will punish their sins. Well, who or what is Gibeah? What happened in Gibeah that was such a big deal? We don't have a clue what he's talking about. So if you want to look that up later and read it, that reference is to something that happened in Judges 19. So when I was reading that in chapter 9, and this Bible is really, really good about giving scripture references. It's not a study Bible in that it tells you anything. There might be little insights here and there, but mostly it just gives references to other scriptures where basically the same thing or something similar is mentioned, but sometimes it will refer to an incident. In this case, I looked at it, said it referred to Judges 19. I'm like, okay, well, the book of Judges, now that tells you a lot right there. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. You remember that. Judges 19, that tells you it's toward the end of the book of Judges, which it's really, it really gets bad at the end of the book of Judges. So when I went back and read it, the incident and I'll just give you this clue, you can read it later. The incident that takes place is very similar to what happened to the two angels that visited Lot in Sodom. Almost the same exact scenario. So, and he's saying to them, they have gone in deep depravity, just like what happened in Gibeah. Oh, okay. Well, now that makes sense. I know exactly what it is they're doing now. It's okay. So, as I said, this Bible gives really good references. And honestly, I think I spent more time going back and reading scriptures than I did in studying exactly what Hosea is saying. But we don't know a lot about Hosea the man, other than what we read here. The commentaries are all over the place as far as the dating of the book, but they are within a few years difference, within 5 years or so difference. So, as we've said earlier, as long as they're within a reasonable amount of difference, that really doesn't mean anything. It's when they're, hundreds of years different that we really want to question that. So we know roughly, and we know from verse 1 of chapter 1 exactly who the kings were. So we can place it there. We know that, all we know about him is that his father's name is Beri. And unlike Jonah, the father's name doesn't mean anything earth-shattering, so that really wasn't any help. But like we said about Amos, Hosea didn't live in a vacuum, and so we have to think of him as a real man. Amos was from the southern kingdom of Judah. Amos came to the northern kingdom of Israel and prophesied, and then guess what? Amos could go back home. Hosea lived there. He lived in it, day in and day out. He lived with the apostasy taking place all around him. He experienced it. And then God called him to do an unthinkable thing. Marry a harlot, marry a prostitute. If we don't know, as we said earlier, if we don't know anything else about the book of Hosea, we know that part. But Hosea has 14 chapters and only about two and maybe not even half, about 2.5 of the chapters is all that talks about that. But that's where our mind always goes when we think about it. So there's so much more to the book, but still it's real. This really happened. And think about Hosea as a man. Think about how he felt. The jealousy that he felt. The betrayal. The shame. The humiliation. How many others pointed and laughed at him? And Hosea said, oh yeah? Well, now I know how God feels. We know Jeremiah as the weeping prophet, but I bet Hosea did a fair amount of weeping himself. In fact, some of the commentaries described Hosea's personal heartache. And by the way, Hosea's name means the Lord saves. It's the same word from where we get the name Joshua in the Old Testament and where we get the name Jesus in the New Testament. It's basically the same word. The J's and the H's, are interchangeable. And his name means the Lord saves. And many of the commentaries compared the heartache that Hosea felt to the heartache of Jesus when he wept over Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I would gather you to myself as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not. Don't you know Hosea felt that way? Some of the commentaries even call the book the cross that Hosea carried. As I said, in order to understand the book of Hosea, we really need to understand Israel's history. The book actually must be understood, the incidences as Elaine said, really need to be understood against 2 Kings, even back to 1 Kings, but against Kings. But the gist of the book and what he was referring to, the things that they were doing, really needed to be compared against and held up against the book of Deuteronomy. Those are the two. You need to know Deuteronomy, and you need to know Hosea for Hosea to make sense. The book of Deuteronomy and the covenant between the Lord and Israel. Israel was to be loyal to the Lord by worshiping Him alone and obeying His commandments. Now, last week we talked a little bit about Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, those blessings and cursings. And if you haven't taken time to read those, let me encourage you to take some time to read that. But especially Deuteronomy 28. In verses 1 through 14 of Deuteronomy 28, we have the blessings that come with the covenant. The blessings for serving and obeying God. And then in verses 15 through 68, we have the curses or the judgments for disobeying, which ultimately ends in exile. And we look at that and we say, wow, that's a whole lot more cursings than there was blessings. I mean, 4 times as many verses for the cursings than there were the blessings. But the reason for that is, when you read those cursings, and you read the judgments that was to come upon Israel, if you read it closely and you watch the flow, you can see times that they would disobey God, and then something would happen and they would come back to Him. We see as they were given, we might say, second chances and third chances and fourth and fifth. I mean, on and on and on. They would be taken into exile and they would come back, and they would be taken and they would come. This would happen and they would come back. And ultimately, at the end of that book, in that chapter, it ends in exile. And that particular exile was what took place in AD 70. That final exile when Rome took them into exile. So you got all these different things that happened to them in those long numbers of verses there. It's like I said, all of these things took place just like the book of Deuteronomy said it would. I mean, that's a whole other rabbit trail to go down, but you can trace those out and see those things as they took place with the history. But here's another thing about the book of Deuteronomy. God also told Moses in chapter 31 of Deuteronomy, in verses 16 through 18, God told him this was going to happen. God told Moses this is going to happen. The New Living Translation puts it this way. The Lord said to Moses, you are about to die. Chapter 31 is when Moses is taken up on Mount Nebo and he dies, and then Joshua takes over. But God said to Moses, you are about to die and join your ancestors. After you are gone, these people will begin to worship foreign gods, the gods of the land where they are going. So they haven't crossed over into the promised land yet, the Canaan. They haven't crossed over yet. They're going to follow the gods of the land where they are going. They will abandon me and break my covenant that I have with them. Then my anger will blaze forth against them. I will abandon them, hiding my face from them, and they will be devoured. We see that happen. Terrible trouble will come down on them, and on that day they will say, these disasters have come down on us because God is no longer among us. At that time I will hide my face from them on account of all the evil they commit by worshiping other gods. As soon as they get there, this is going to happen. And then on through their history. In fact, on through all of the Old Testament history, this is the battle, the idolatry that took place. In the New Living Translation here, where it said they will begin to worship foreign gods, other translations say they play the harlot. Now, that's New American Standard, that's King James language. We don't talk that way. Our translations, our modern translations say, they as it said here, worship foreign gods, or they they marry prostitutes. They don't use those words. But we need to know that. It's not so innocuous as to say they begin to worship foreign gods. I mean, as bad as that is, that doesn't, we just can't grasp how bad it really was. It's not just a matter of worshiping something else. It's not just a matter of something else having first place in your life. You know, when we talk about the applications, we often talk about, you know, what gods are in our lives. You know, do we worship sports? Do we worship this, that? In that sense, we simply talk about something else having priority in our life. But it's so much more than that, and we really need to know that when the translations say they play the harlot, the reason for that is that to worship the false gods literally meant to participate in pagan fertility rites, which included sexual acts with temple prostitutes, both male and female. This was specifically forbidden in Leviticus 19:29 and Deuteronomy 23:17. So let's think about this for a minute. Why did God feel in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, why did God feel that he had to specifically forbid this? Why did he specifically forbid that?
Because of the offsprings and diluting they were supposed to marry each other.
Yeah, they were, but there's more to it than that. It's not just what they would do later on. He had to specifically forbid it because it was happening. Present tense. It was happening in Canaan, and that's where they were going. In fact, Leviticus 18. If you really want to know what was going on in Canaan, read Leviticus 18. And you can write out in your Bible or write somewhere when you read it what that's referring to. When it says they made their child pass through the fire, you know that means child sacrifice. All of these things. Read Leviticus 18.
Is that Baal? Was that when Baal was they're worshiping Baal, putting the infant in to burn alive in the...
That Baal wasn't the one that they burned the child for. That was one of the other ones, but it was all of that.
Ashtar.
You know, Ashtar was the wife of Baal. It was Chemosh or Molech. Molech is where they burned the babies. Yeah. But you can go through that chapter and read, and when it says you shall not do this, you shall not do this, you shall not do this, God's not just pulling things out of the air that you don't need to be doing. He's saying they are. When you read "don't do this," he's saying because they are doing this,
and the results are.
That you will, I will turn my back on you. Don't do that. When you find something, you know, the thing that's going around now on social media, it's this, if Paul was still writing letters, we'd all be getting one because of what's going on in the churches. Every letter that Paul wrote to a church was to address something that was wrong in that church. So anytime, particularly in the Old Testament, anytime you read that something is specifically forbidden, it's because there was a very good chance that they were about to do it. They might do it. You know, you don't say to your child, don't jump in the creek if there's no creeks around. You know, you're going to say something, don't do whatever it is they're about to do. In Joshua 24, verse 23, in Joshua 24, that's at the end of Joshua. They have been in the promised land. Joshua is old. He's about to die, and he's called together the people and given them basically his final teaching. And in chapter 24, verse 23, he says to them, "Put away the foreign gods which are in your midst, and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel." They're still there. Put them away. Get rid of them. Even before the division of the northern and the southern kingdoms, God told Solomon. Now, we've often talked about, when Solomon died and his son Rehoboam became king, and that's when the kingdom was divided. Well, that is when it actually took place. But God had already told Solomon it was going to happen. God told Solomon in 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 11. I'm not going to read all of that, but in that section, it says in verse 5, Solomon went after the Ashtoreth, that's the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable. The word detestable means a disgusting or filthy, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Verse 7, then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. This he also did for all his foreign wives. And remember, he had over 700 wives and 300 concubines, who all burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. He built temples for all of them for their gods. God was so angry with Solomon that he told him that he would tear the kingdom apart and give the northern kingdom to Solomon's servant, who was Jeroboam. I'm going to tear it apart and give it to Jeroboam. Because I said, I won't do it in your lifetime because of your father David. But once you're gone, this is what's going to happen. But God created this covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai, just like he created the covenant of marriage in the Garden of Eden. And he didn't intend either to be broken, but they have been. And that's where we find ourselves today in the book of Hosea. Hosea, his whole purpose was to expose and reveal this breakdown, this breach of the covenant, and to announce that God was about to keep his promise. Now, what promise was that? His promise of judgment. Remember, we talked last week in Amos, we said that the thing about Amos, as hard as it was to read all the things that were happening, we could draw hope from it because God always did what he said he would do. Blessings and judgment. You can count on what he says. So here, Hosea is to say God is about to keep his promise of judgment that he gave in Deuteronomy 28. But now it's been more than 650 years since God promised he was going to bring judgment on them. He's patient. He's waiting. He sent the prophets. In Hebrews 1:1, when we started studying Hebrews, he said that in the past he spoke to the people by the prophets in various ways. And this is the way he spoke through Hosea. When we get to the other prophets, he speaks to them different ways. But he made this promise of judgment, and he was patient for over 650 years before he brought this judgment. He always keeps his promises, both of blessing and of judgment. Matthew Henry said that the book was more like the book of Proverbs than any other prophet, because it's just, almost one-liners, one after the other. And he said that the book could be called Hosea's sayings rather than Hosea's sermons. So any questions or comments on the background part of the book?
No, but I was just thinking about what you shared with us a little earlier. The lady got caught on an elevator and just sat down and did her prayer list.
Yeah.
Is that not what God was asked of all of us?
Yeah.
You get in trouble, I take care of you.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that should be on her.
Yeah.
That's just an example.
I would panic, actually, in an elevator. The only nightmares I've ever had in my life have been of being in an elevator and it falling. I'm terrified of elevators.
They won't fall.
Well, can't tell me that might be my nightmares, but
They might get stuck though.
but they might get stuck. So what a great use of time. She used that time to do what God had called her to do. And Hosea, in his time, did what
Her covenant with God.
Her covenant with God, exactly. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that he used the word divorce. God divorced.
Now, that's not in my translation. Where is that?
It's in one of the translations that I read. I'll let you know what it is. That it was like God did. He divorced the house of Israel.
Yeah,
I think in the Tanakh. It may be in the Tanakh.
that's just the Old Testament.
Well, but that's an older version of the Old Testament. It's what the
It's a Jewish Old Testament.
right. It's what the Orthodox Jews use.
So,
It was in one of the. I'll let you know, but I just thought that was an interesting translation.
I saw that too. Somewhere.
yeah. Betty's her translation uses it's a Jewish Bible.
Well, I've got the.
Oh, did you bring?
It up in the Jewish
You brought the other one? Okay.
I brought the NIV.
Oh, okay. Yeah, she showed me that one the other day. Okay. Anything else on the? Yeah.
Well, just while she was looking at it, just, that doesn't really matter, but did Hosea have more than one wife?
Apparently not.
Because that was thinking.
It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that he does.
I didn't get that. I can't remember because he.
No, this is the only one that he had, as far as I know.
That's unusual right there.
Well, yeah. Here's the thing. Yeah, we talk about that. People will a lot of times throw up that that Abraham only. I'm trying to think. You know, David had multiple wives, and Abraham just had Sarah, but then he had a child with Hagar. But then after Sarah died, he married another one. But David particularly, and Solomon had multitudes of wives. Many of them did. But the thing is that we've often said the Bible sometimes is descriptive and sometimes it's prescriptive. When it's prescriptive, it tells you exactly do this or don't do that. Descriptive just tells you what happened. God's plan, as Jesus said, I believe it's in Matthew 19, and he quotes from Genesis, God's original plan was one man and one woman. That was the original plan. The fact that David had multiple wives didn't mean that God condoned it. It means that that's what David did. So the prophets, though, I was trying to think just off the top of my head, just going through the prophets that I know of that were married, that I know were married. I don't think any of them had more than one. Now, I might be wrong on that, but I don't seem to remember that any of them did.
Well, it doesn't matter.
Well, it's an interesting thought because so many others did. But those who were called by God and adhered to God's word did what God said they should do, even in this case. So, anything else on the background? Yeah, it's just kind of a side note here. Have any of y'all ever been a part of a book club? Okay. I haven't. And so I don't know when you're part of a book club how you take a whole book and how you even talk about it. So we actually, chapter by chapter. Well, you know, we may get through early or we may not, but anyway, I'm just kind of treating these bigger books as kind of like a book club. We just discuss anything you want to say anywhere in the book. You know, we'll jump back and forth and do whatever. That's the only way I know to do this. But anything else on the background of the history? Okay, well, let's look at the book itself. And like I said, excuse me. Obviously, we don't have time to cover everything in the book. But if you have questions or even something that comes to mind, just be sure and ask that as we go along. So look at verse 1. The word of the Lord which came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, the kings of Judah, that's the southern kingdom, and during the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, that's the northern kingdom. Now, Jeroboam, there are two Jeroboam who are kings during the time of the northern kingdom, but they're distinguished by who their father is. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, was the first one, Jeroboam the first. This is Jeroboam the second, and most Bibles, if you have a Bible that has a chart or anything about the kings, it will say Jeroboam the first and Jeroboam the second. But this is Jeroboam the second. But so Amos, when we were in Amos last time, Amos gave the setting for his book by mentioning just two kings. Uzziah in the southern kingdom of Judah, and Jeroboam the second in the northern kingdom. Just gave us those two. The fact that Hosea gives us Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah tells us that he came after Amos, and he prophesied a longer period of time during all these kings that rotated through in the southern kingdom. Now, most likely he came on the scene during the end of Uzziah's reign, because Uzziah reigned 52 years, and Amos prophesied during that time. But the fact that he only mentions Jeroboam in Israel, in the northern kingdom, and he prophesied until the days of Hezekiah, means that he was there through 5 more northern kings. He only gives us the name of one, but there are 5 more that he would have been there through their times. Now, the question has to come up, why didn't he mention those? We really don't know why, but one of the reasons could possibly be that there was a lot of political chaos that took place during that time. These 6 kings, Jeroboam and these other 5, they would reign for a total of 30 years before Assyria would conquer Israel and take them into exile. So you and I, we think, 6 kings in 30 years, that's not that big a deal. It's, that's 5 presidential terms. Six presidential terms. 6 4 is 24. But the thing is, when you look at all of those kings, out of those 6, 4 of them were assassinated along the way. Jeroboam, that he mentions, Jeroboam's son ruled 6 months after Jeroboam died, and then he was assassinated, and the one who assassinated him only reigned for 1 month before somebody killed him. I mean, this was a time of political chaos, upheaval. And so it's not surprising, actually, that Hosea wouldn't go into all of that, because that's not important for what he needs to speak on. The political chaos, where in Amos, the political chaos and the judicial, all that was going on with Amos was important and played a part in what he was actually saying. But that doesn't play into what Hosea is talking about. So he doesn't talk about that. The last 3 sort of overlap each other. So who's king and who's reigning? I mean, it was a mess. But as I said on your lesson sheet, the biblical background, if you went back and read that, can be found in 2 Kings chapters 15 through 18 and 2 Chronicles chapters 26 through 29. Now, Hosea's main target, his main focus was the northern kingdom. But like we said earlier, his message was for the entire people of God, as he often mentions Judah. As we said when we studied Jonah and Amos, Assyria, as Hosea began his ministry, Assyria was in that lull, that time of peace. Jonah had just been there, and they had gotten saved, so that generation was a time of peace. But as that generation died out and the next generation came in, then they began attacking their neighbors. They began going out further and further and drawing more and more in. So the economic climate in Amos, the kingdoms were flourishing, and it was that way as Hosea began. But just as he began. Also, like we saw in the book of Amos, we see in Hosea that there are many of the same crimes too. In fact, if you just look over in chapter 4, verse 2, and then you just start ticking them off. There's swearing, deception, murder, stealing, adultery. They employ violence so that bloodshed follows bloodshed. and the land mourns. I mean, some of the same things were happening that were happening in Amos, and even getting worse now because there wasn't the political stability as there had been in Amos. As you read, I'm sure you saw that there was a religious hypocrisy, there was political revolt, there were foreign alliances. Well, we're going to send to Egypt for help. No, we're going to send to Assyria for help. In the early days, they thought they could get help from Assyria. Well, that didn't work out well. There's selfish arrogance, there's spiritual ingratitude. But the biggest thing was the idolatry. That was the key. As I said earlier, in 733 BC, Assyria attacked the northern areas and made them pay tribute. But then in 722, the entire nation was taken into captivity. But what we have to remember about Hosea is that until Hosea came along, the political existence of Israel was never in question. Now, Amos prophesied it, but they couldn't see it. Amos just said, it's going to happen. But when you looked around, everybody's 401ks were still doing great. You could buy anything you wanted at the store. Everything was going well. They couldn't see what was going to come down the road. But when Hosea comes along, now you're beginning to see these things take place. And Amos prophesied they would be taken into captivity. Hosea saw it happen. Either he saw it happen or he died just shortly before it did. So then, we begin. Look at verse 2. When the Lord first spoke, think about that for a minute. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, first words, first thing, go take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry. That's hard to say, harlotry. For the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. At Hosea's call, his call, God says, go do this. Can you just imagine? Imagine. God said, do this. So here's a question for you. Was she a prostitute before he married her or not? If you've got a study Bible, what do you study Bible have to say about it? What do you think about it? Was she a prostitute before he married her or not?
I think she was.
I think he said.
I think that's the reason that.
If he was doing what the Lord said, yeah.
The Lord said, yeah. But like what'd you start saying?
I don't have any proof to back it up. I tend to think she wasn't in the beginning.
Okay.
I tend to think she became unfaithful as Israel became unfaithful.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and I think that's what we want to believe.
Well, mine says, and this is where I had to start over
Yeah.
a dozen times. Go and marry a prostitute so that some of her children will be conceived in prostitution.
Yeah. That's what it says. But we're like,
And
surely not.
If she has children with him, is that children in prostitution?
No.
And
The ones, if she's married to him, they are not.
And so that's where I had to just start over and just, what word am I leaving out?
Yeah. Yeah, I do that because I'm bad about missing a word now and then. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that?
What's yours?
All right, I'm going to tell you mine. I'm going to tell you what the commentary is saying, and I'm going to tell you mine.
Well, according to what my study Bible says, it's not what I thought at all.
Mm-hmm.
And says that the word, my Bible uses the word whoredom.
Whoredom, yeah.
Okay. Throughout the book is a broad term of various kinds of sexual misconduct, and only in certain contexts does it refer to prostitution. And it before that it says God instructs Hosea to marry, but foretells that his wife's unfaithfulness, like Elaine said, will be an image for Israel's unfaithfulness.
Right. So the commentaries differ on it. Of the broad range of commentaries that I read, they are divided on this. Some say, and this is the reason for it, some say, no, she was not, just like your study Bible said, and like you feel, no, she was not. God was speaking of her future. She would commit adultery on him. She would marry him, but she would, in the future, commit adultery. Now, we've talked about before something that's called the prophetic perfect, or the prophetic present, meaning that God prophesies something, speaking in present tense or even in past tense. It's something that is so sure to happen that you can speak of it in the past tense. So there's that. The reasoning for that, that she would commit adultery in the future, but she was pure when they married. The reasoning behind that was, they say, first of all, God would never ask his prophet to marry somebody like that. I mean, God is holy. And he would not ask his prophet to marry a flagrant sinner. Would not do that. And that, in keeping with the analogy of Israel, that Israel was pure when God made the covenant with her when he brought her out of Egypt. That's that line of reasoning. But let me ask you this. Was Israel pure when he brought her out of Egypt? No, she wasn't. She brought a lot of those gods from Egypt with her. You know, and you probably already know this, but all of those plagues that Moses brought, that God sent through Moses brought on Egypt, every one of those plagues was in opposition to one of the Egyptian gods. To show that God was, as it will say, I forget where it is. But he talks about the living God. There's a difference between the living God and dead idols or false gods. And every one of those was corresponding to one of their gods. And so Israel brought those gods out with her. We know that because in Joshua 24, verse 23, we mentioned verse 23 earlier, but in verse 24, Joshua said, "So fear the Lord and serve him wholeheartedly. Put away forever the idols your ancestors." Remember, going into the promised land, this is the second generation of Israelites. You know, the 40 years wandering, all the original generation died out. The second generation. Put away forever the idols your ancestors worshipped when they lived beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and served the Lord alone. They brought these idols out with them. There's many places through, I didn't take time to look it up, but through Exodus and Leviticus and so forth, where it talks about the idols that they brought out of Egypt with them. At Mount Sinai, in Exodus 20, at Mount Sinai, God said, "You shall have no other gods before me." Now, why would he say that? Because they did have other gods. Get rid of them. They did have other gods that they brought with them from Egypt. So no, they were not pure when the covenant was initiated. But who initiated the covenant? God did. God initiated the covenant. Okay? That's that view. That's that side of it. Now let's look at the other side. Others say, yes, she was already a prostitute. By the way, Hosea wasn't the only prophet that was asked to do weird things. You know, Jonah, had to go to the enemy. Isaiah, when we get to Isaiah 20, Isaiah was called to walk around naked for 3 years. I just have to think about wintertime, But 3 years, that's different. That's different. Jeremiah walked around with a yoke on his neck. Ezekiel was to get down on the ground and play war like a little boy. Ezekiel was also called to do just a lot of weird things. But why did God ask these men to do these strange things? As we said in Hebrews, God spoke in by the prophets in various ways. Why would God do that? Why would God use all these strange and different ways?
To illustrate a point.
Exactly. Because it took drastic measures at times to get people's attention. But none of those were as painful and personally as drastic as what Hosea was called to do. Now, the word harlot or prostitute or whoredom, as you read it, is used 10 other times. That particular word is used 10 other times in the Old Testament, according to the King James Concordance. But it's never used for something that will happen in the future. It's always something that is or has happened. It's the same root word that is used to describe Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. It is what she did. So there's the two sides on it. Now, here's my opinion, and this is just my opinion. My opinion is, I think, like Rahab, she was a prostitute. I mean, if you take it literally, he said, go and marry a prostitute or marry a harlot or one of whoredom. But I think, in my opinion again, I think she had been a temple prostitute. One of those cultic, that took places in those gods and those rites. I think that's what she was. That's what she had been. But I think, again, opinion, I think she convinced Hosea that life was behind her. She may have even used Rahab as an example. Rahab ended up marrying one of the two spies. Rahab ended up being
She's in the lineage.
the grandmother of Obed, which makes her the great grandmother of who did Ruth marry? Boaz, and the great great grandmother of David. So that puts her in Jesus' lineage. She may have even used Rahab as an example. Look, Rahab changed. I mean, that's what she was, but she changed. I've changed. So, in a way that sort of plays both sides of the issue. But I think that makes sense to me.
But did he pick her, or did God pick her for him?
That we don't know. We're really not given. In verse 3, it just says he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblam, and she conceived and bore him a son. By the way, that's how we know that this child was not a child of adultery. She conceived and bore him a son. So it's his child. That one we know, the first one. So I don't know. We don't know how they met. We don't know how that came about. But we just know that's how it ended up. And the fact that she had a child with him, I think that, he may have been looking at it as she was a prostitute, or she was this when he married her. But she had been forgiven. So
why is it important to make the distinction between whether she was a prostitute in the beginning or a prostitute or became a prostitute later?
it really isn't, except that we want to, what's the word? Not whitewash. We want to be comfortable with our scriptures.
Make it more powerful.
More palatable. That's the word. Like you will read in a lot of commentaries that Rahab wasn't really a harlot. She was an innkeeper.
No, she really was.
She really was. She exactly really was. There is no question about the word. But
Might have been an innkeeper too.
she was an innkeeper too. But we want to make it more palatable. We don't want these things that don't look right. Or don't, God would never do that. Yeah, God did do that. That's exactly what God did.
Will you do that lineage again? I lost track.
Okay. See if I got, there's Rahab, and she married one of the two spies, and I forget, Salmon, I think was his name.
That's who it was.
Salmon
I thought
patties.
surely his name is not Salmon. But
Salmon patties. Okay, we remember that.
That's who she
Sounds
married. She married
Okay.
the salmon.
We use whatever we need to help us remember.
Thank you.
So she married Salmon, and then Obed was, I don't remember if, I think Obed may have been their child. I believe that's right. Obed was,
You connected her going to David's lineage.
no, not Gomer. Not Gomer, just Rahab.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's where I.
Yeah. Rahab came down, and then David was in the lineage. We don't know anything else about this woman other than what we have in Hosea here.
Okay.
So, but that's my opinion on that. Maybe she used Rahab as an example, but she really didn't change. She may have said she did, but she really didn't. But can you imagine Hosea's reaction when God told him to do that? I can't get over that. But Hosea did. He did what God told him to do. Verse 3, he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son.
I kept trying to make Gomer somebody other than Gomer.
We don't want to call it Gomer, do we? I mean, it's just too much.
I mean, surely there's a different twist to that name.
Gomer.
Gomer. We'll call her Gomer. Yeah.
Gomer.
Yeah. So we don't say golly.
She was going to have a rough life from the time she got that name. That's just what it was.
Well, I don't know, remember, because I didn't go through all these verse by verse in our lesson, but so while we're on that subject, I don't know about you, but every time I read that they ate raisin cakes, I think of Little Debbie. I just can't get past the Little Debbie raisin cakes. Anyway, that's where we are. What can we say? But anyway, from here on, from the time he married her, she had that child, we need to know the history of Israel in order for the rest of this book to make sense. We need to know about the Canaanite religion. We need to know about the cultic worship and the ritual prostitution and all that in order to really understand what the book of Hosea is saying. And we cannot dig into that, in the amount of time we have. We just can't. In fact, I started down more rabbit trails than I can even imagine. I've got notes at home that I want to go back and read. But now Isaiah is going to have 66 chapters, so I don't know how much time I'm going to have. But anyway, we need to know these things. But even without knowing it, like I said, as much as we'd like to, we just can't dig into all that. But even without knowing it, we can grasp the gist of what the book is saying. And it is saying that God loves his people. And God wants his people to be faithful to him. Just like Hosea loved Gomer and wanted her to be faithful to him. He really, really wanted that. But she committed adultery with other men. And Israel, as we see throughout the book, committed spiritual adultery with Baal. Now, again, here in the South, we've always called it Baal. It's really pronounced Baal. It's B-A'-Al, Baal. But she committed spiritual adultery with Baal and a multitude of other gods with the temple prostitutes of all these other gods. And these temples were everywhere. You just got to read some of that in Kings to say, one of the things is something about under every tree. One of the things in here, and I don't remember where the verse was now, but it talked about rocks in a field, and one of the commentaries said that there were so many of these altars set up all over the place that the farmers were having a hard time plowing their fields for all these little altars set up everywhere. And all these gods had their own following of people. The word we need to know, though, here's one thing you really need to know. The word we need to know as we study the prophets, and actually as we even just look around us today, is the word syncretism. Let me spell it for you. syncretism. Did you get that? syncretism.
Are you pronouncing it syncretism?
Syncretism.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
I've always pronounced it a different way.
How'd you pronounce it?
It's like diaspora and diaspora.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. Now that you said it right, I can't remember how to say it.
Well, I'm not saying that's right, but that's just the way I've always heard it. It's syncretism. In its simplest form, in its simplest terms, what it means is, it means the combining of different religions. Combining of different religions. I was trying to find a really good definition for it, and I was going all over the place in my Bible software trying to find. I finally had to go to just plain old online dictionary, and I thought, well, that's where it says the combining of different religions. But I was trying to find a really good example of it, and I just did a search on it in some of the commentaries, and I found this definition, and I thought this was really good. This is in Warren Wiersbe's commentary, but it's in his commentary on Colossians chapter 1. But I think it fits for Hosea as well as for our own application today. Warren Wiersbe said, people are trying to harmonize and unite many different schools of thought and come up with one superior religion. Our evangelical churches today are in danger of diluting the faith in their loving attempt to understand the beliefs of others. Mysticism, legalism, Eastern religions, asceticism, man-made philosophies are secretly creeping into the churches, he said. Here's the thing, they are not denying Christ, but they are dethroning Him and robbing Him of His rightful place of preeminence. When we try to appease everybody's idea of who Jesus is, that's where I have some of the problems with some of the things we're seeing today. Well, it's all about Jesus, yeah, but which Jesus? What Jesus? Is it the Jesus of the Bible or Jesus of our own imaginations? Syncretism is any time you say God and, or Jesus and.
Andy Stanley had started yesterday or Sunday, that kind of relates to what you're saying. And his theory was that religion should, and I could have got the whole thing wrong, but what it meant to me was religion should start with Jesus, birth of Jesus, and then use the Old Testament as examples of how behaviors don't work.
Are you sure that was Andy or Charles?
No, it was Andy.
I'm surprised because he has often said we need to unhitch from the Old Testament and not even use it.
He basically was saying that when he said, and then go back to the stories of the Old Testament.
We cannot unhitch from the Old Testament. Yeah.
And that's what I got out of it. Go back to the Old Testament with the stories of how behaviors did not work.
Yeah. I mean, God simply said, you cannot do this. But like I said, anytime we say God and or Jesus and, that's wrong. It's God only, Jesus only. And that's what was happening in Israel and also in Judah. False gods were very real to them. You know, we have a tendency to say things like, well, you know, they're just graven images or they're just molded, you know, and we joke about that scripture in Isaiah where he talks about you cut down a tree and you use half of it to cook your supper and the other half you carve into your God, you bow down to it. And we say, we never do anything like that, but anytime we say God and, or Jesus and, we've done that same thing. Their false gods were very real to them. Baal worship came after they entered Canaan. That is true. But they worshipped and brought the gods of Egypt with them. So they had Joshua would talk about the gods of your fathers beyond the Euphrates, even those that were brought over when Abraham came over.
And in a lot of ways, they feared their false gods
Yeah.
worse than they feared the true God that they experienced.
Exactly.
They feared the ones they didn't.
Yeah.
That they had no real reason to have those gods, but they feared them.
They feared them. I call it, in a lighthearted, I call it hedging your bets. They wanted to, well, we need to do this for this God because this is the God of fertility, and we need to do this for this God because this is the God of the crops, and this is the God of the rain, and this is they want to make sure that when God is the God of all of it. And when you start looking for this in the scriptures, you start seeing it more and more. You start seeing where it talks about they worship the hosts of heaven, or they worshiped the queen of heaven. That's a false goddess. And this Ashtaroth that supposedly they viewed as the wife of Baal is actually, when you take it over into the Greek, that's Venus.
That's also where we get the word Easter.
Ishtar, exactly. Yeah. So, when you start looking for these, you see them anywhere, or you see them everywhere. Once they entered Canaan, they didn't disregard God. And here's something I think is very important, especially for today. Once they entered Canaan, they didn't disregard God. They just added Baal to their mix of gods. Remember, when the northern kingdom and southern kingdom was divided, that Jeroboam built those two golden calves, made those two golden calves, put one in Bethel, or one in Dan and one in Bethel for them to worship. The image of Baal was a bull. And so that's what that was, this golden calf. Set them up for them to worship. They saw, here's the thing, they saw God, Elohim, Jehovah. They saw God as the God of their fathers, the God of the past, the God that did this all back there. That was okay for them back there, but we're today.
So they treated him as history, like we treat him as history sometimes.
Yeah, well,
not we as believers,
yeah.
But people that do
exactly.
People that do not want to believe the scripture as inspired.
Oh well, that was back then.
That was back then.
Yeah, and we do some of the same things. Oh yeah, that's old. We don't need to be doing that. This new way now. This is the way we need to be doing it. These new gods. They're the gods. These are the way of the future.
I saw a program with archaeology, and there was hundreds
Yeah.
of gods. And some of them look like, on the screen, look like maybe they were that big.
Yeah.
Where they had dug them up out.
Yeah.
And it was in the same area that we're talking about.
Yeah, and they would use these representations because those little ones they could carry with them.
And it was just hundreds.
And the thought just comes to mind when Jacob, when Jacob was running from Esau, and he went up to Haran, stayed with his uncle Laban, and you know the whole story, and he married Leah and he married Rachel. When he came back, and Laban came after him. The reason Laban came after him is because Rachel had stolen the household gods.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, they had their household gods. So this is, Rachel of all people that we revere Rachel. Yeah, exactly. But they viewed, when they came into Canaan, they reviewed that's old. We don't need that anymore. We need to talk about something new and exciting. We see that happening today. Absolutely. We want something new. We want something different. It can't be the same that it's always been. Well, yes, it can. Well, obviously, we don't have time to dig into all the things they were doing. Let me give you this real quickly, or I am going to run out of time. We don't have time to go over all the judgments and all the calls to repent, but there's one thing I want to share with you that might help you see God's love and mercy in this book. As I was reading it, and I was reading the judgments, and I was reading the things that they did, I was noticing these words of mercy and these words of hope, as we've mentioned. Every now and then, there was just a line or a few verses of going to call them back. I'm not going to leave them. I just kept seeing them. And so I was getting ready to actually take out a piece of paper and chart it down. This part's talking about judgment, and this part's talking about mercy, and then it talks about judgment, and it talks about mercy. And then, fortunately, I ran into a commentary that had already done that. The Bible Knowledge Commentary did that for me. And so I was amazed at how it progressed through this book. I'm like, you see the mind blown. My mind was blown. You could see God's judgment, but then just like a parent that says, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you, you'd see God's mercy. But you can almost feel his tears. But I love you so much. And then he promised to bring them back to himself. And that there's this pattern. So you might want to write this down. Get you a place where you can write something down, because you want to go back and read this way if you can, if you get time. You're going to need a little bit of space.
Oh, a lot of space.
A little bit, yeah. Okay, you ready?
Is it for the Bible or scrap paper?
Well, wherever you want to write, but I'd write it on paper first and then put it in the Bible.
Well,
You got you?
I'll do my Bible.
Okay, ready? Here we go. In chapter 1, you just write down chapter 1, verses 2 through 9. We see judgment. And I'm not going to take the time to read over that. You can read over that later. Chapter 1, 2 through 9, we see judgment. In chapter 1, 10, verse 10, through chapter 2, verse 1, we find mercy and hope. Chapter 1, verses 2 through 9, judgment. Following immediately after that, chapter 1, verse 10, through chapter 2, verse 1, is mercy and hope. Listen to this in verses 10 and 11 of chapter 1. Yet, he's just said, name this child I have no pity or no love. Name this child, you're not my people. Verse 9. And in verse 10 he says, yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sands of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. It will come about that in that place where it has been said of them, you're not my people, it will then be said to them, you are my people. You are the sons of the living God. And the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together. And they will appoint for themselves one leader. And they will go up from the land. And for great will be the day of Jezreel. Mercy and hope. Next, in chapter 2, verse 2 through verse 13, we again see judgment. After he's given them hope, then there's judgment again. And then in chapter 2, verse 14 through chapter 3, verse 5, again there's hope. As we just said earlier, verse 5 of chapter 3, afterward the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they will come trembling to the Lord and his goodness in the last days. Mercy and hope. Chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 5, verse 14, judgment. Chapter 4, verse 1 says, because there's no faith or kindness or knowledge of God in the land, swearing, deception, murder, stealing, there's all of this, he says, is happening. That's the judgment. Then in chapter 5, verse 15, through chapter 6, verse 3, again there's hope and mercy. Verse 3 of chapter 6 says, so let us press on to know the Lord. His going forth is as certain as the dawn, and he will come to us like the rain, like the spring rain watering the earth. Mercy, we see. Chapter 6, verse 4, all the way through chapter 11, verse 7, again there's judgment. Great big long area of judgment. And in that, in chapter 9 and 10, there's 4 pictures. I found Israel like grapes. I found Israel is a luxuriant vine. Israel is like a heifer. Israel was a youth. All this
Are you saying
judgment.
11:7?
11 verse 7.
Because in 3 and 4 is where he talks about, I've led them gently, of course, of a man with bonds of love.
Yeah, there are some lines and snippets in between there of tender words, but overall it's judgment. And then chapter 11, verses 8 through 11 is hope. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I surrender you, Israel? How can I do that? And then chapter 11, verse 12 through chapter 13, verse 16 is judgment. And then chapter 14, verses 1 through 8 is hope. Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled because of your iniquity. Take words with you and return to the Lord. Say to him, take away all our iniquity. Confess your sin. Receive us graciously that we may present the fruit of our lips, our sacrifice of praise. We're sorry, verse 3. We're sorry, Assyria will not save us. And on down through there, all through that. All that section speaks of the coming kingdom. Verse 8 of chapter 14, O Ephraim, what more have I to do with idols? It is I who answer and look after you. I am like a luxuriant cypress. From me comes your fruit. And then verse 9 of chapter 14 is the epilogue to the book. Hosea says in closing, whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the righteous will walk in them, but transgressors will stumble in them.
I got lost at 12:16.
Okay.
11 or chapter 11, verse 12
Through chapter
through
13.
12, verse
Chapter 11, verse 12 through
Right.
chapter 13,
13.
verse 16.
That's still judgment.
That's still judgment. And then chapter 14, verses 1 through 8 is hope, and verse 9 is the epilogue. But I think if you go back and read the book with that in mind, you'll see the flow to the book. I mean, I would really like to have taken the time to dig into all of these things, the judgments and how they happened, and the hope and how it would come about. But obviously we just can't do that in a book this long. So anything else? I have one more thing to say in closing, but anything else you want to say about the book? Did I answer your questions? Did I get your question? I don't remember even what your question was now, Betty.
What's the definition of prostitute? Is it a one-time thing?
Okay, yeah. The way that it's used in this book, it refers to the temple prostitution. That was, for lack of a better word, that was their job. They were the temple prostitutes of the different religions, the different cults. In Rahab's case, it was, that's what she did. That's how she made her living. It was just...
Well, thanks to the king tossing her aside.
Yeah, tossing her aside and living in the wall,
After he was done with her, what else was she going to do?
Yeah, exactly. That's the thought on that. What else was she going to do? She didn't know what else to do. And I don't remember the chapter and verse, but it's in Genesis where Tamar is another use of the word, where I believe it's Tamar, is the one who tricks Judah into fathering her child. And then I was like, how am I going to say this? Yeah, but yeah, exactly. And so in that sense, it's just outside of marriage, period. So the word is the same word, but it's used in different settings throughout the Old Testament.
So the definition is one time or 100 times.
Yeah, it doesn't make any difference. It's any sexual activity outside of marriage.
Because, you can use prostitution in terms of other,
Yeah,
I guess, activities.
Yeah.
The only word I can think of.
yeah. But that's what it was.
So it's one time or 100 times.
Yeah. It doesn't. It's anything outside of marriage. Now, in Matthew, I believe it's in chapter 5, when Jesus given the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, "You have heard it said that thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say to you, anyone who looks on a woman with lust in their heart has committed adultery with her in his heart already." The Jews, and he goes on to talk about divorce. Jews, the Pharisees particularly, had found loopholes. They used adultery as you could only call it adultery if you were married. And so therefore, if you weren't technically married, you weren't really committing adultery, So they were finding loopholes around it. And that's what Jesus was talking against in that whole section of the Sermon on the Mount, is against the loopholes that they were using. Any other thoughts on Hosea?
This, for us, it could have been worded so much simpler, but for them, it was exactly what they needed. It was exactly.
Because we, like you said, we don't know all these stories, and we're like, I don't know what's he even talking about. But it's like, you and I would say ground zero, we know exactly what we're talking about and what event it was. And so by saying Gibeah, they knew exactly where it was, and they knew exactly the event he was talking about.
It hit home with all of them.
It really did. It really did. Well, let me say this in closing. One commentary said, as part of the bride of Christ, as the church, we have been called to holy living and yet confess our corporate lack of first love commitment to the bridegroom. I look at that as we remember that Jesus told the church at Ephesus in Revelation 2 that she had left her first love. Have we, and speaking of our application for today, have we, as the bride of Christ, left our first love? Have we mingled that first love with the love of the world? Have we committed syncretism? Like Israel, God calls for us to have no other gods in our life. We must live in fidelity, but if we have slipped, He calls us to confess and come back just like He called them. So, anything else? Next week is Isaiah. Isaiah has 66 chapters. What are we going to do? Well, what do we do? We are at least going to divide it in two. Not 33 and 33, but 39 and 27. As you'll see on your paper, chapters 1 through 39 really speaks more of judgment and it actually follows the line of the Old Testament. Chapters 20, the last 27 chapters, 40 through 66, actually speak more along the lines of the New Testament. But there are prophecies of the Messiah in both sections. So I'm not exactly sure how we're going to do it, but we will at least divide it up, 39 and 27. And if it starts running long, we may even divide the 39 up. We'll just have to see how it goes next week. I may get it all down. We may not have time to get through it all, and we'll finish it the next week. We'll just have to see how it goes. So pray for me this week. Anything else?
So we should shoot for looking at for next week.
Shoot for the first 39. That's going to be a gob of reading as it is.
I like that word, God.
I'm a real sophisticated teacher here.
That's one of my favorite words is a gob.
Good thing. Yeah. But, we just do the best we can do. Read as much as you can and do what you can. That's all I can say.
Well, maybe we can start out that I have to read the first paragraph.
Yeah, if you have to read the first verse 5 times, that really slows you down a little bit, so.
Oh, it was more than that. I kept thinking I let that word somewhere. And I took my finger.
Right. All right.
I love Amplified.
Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for Hosea. Bless his heart. We just feel for him. Our heart breaks for what he wants.